Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is our first event as an official PEN Center after receiving accreditation a couple of weeks ago. And this very evening, in fact, we received our official letter from PEN International. We will be conducting this session in English so that everybody can understand us, and we are hoping to finish within 1 hour. So thank you for being with us tonight. This is a very important discussion as we are talking about topics which affect us all. And we come together at this time of the year to honor Daphne Caruana Galicia's legacy on the 4th anniversary of her assassination. And we want to talk about what this has taught us. Towards the end of the session, there will be time for the audience to ask their questions. So if you have any questions, please place it in the chat, even if you are watching us on Facebook Live. I will ask you to please use the chat facility and stay muted during the discussion so that we will avoid background noise and avoid distracting and disturbing others while they are speaking. In the interest of time, I'd like all the speakers and even people asking questions to keep their interventions rather short so that we will be able to explore several aspects of the topics. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists in alphabetical order. We have Marie Bregulio. She is a multimedia writer, academic, and researcher in the fields of economics, governance, environment, and culture. She's a regular media contributor and screenwriter. She won the STEM Engaged Researcher Award this year and the National Book Prize last year. Matthew Caruana Galizia is a software engineer and data journalist. He's the director of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation, whose mission is justice, journalism, and memory. Herman Grech is the editor-in-chief at the Times of Malta and has regularly contributed to media giants such as BBC World, DPA, and The Economist. He's also a theatre director, author, and producer. George Mali, as the head of Department of Media and Communications at the University of Malta, he is also an author and a well-known cartoonist. I will ask you to all mute yourselves, please, at this time. So, for my first question, I will ask what it says on the tin. 4 years after Daphne, what have we learned? Now, I cannot see all the panelists at this time, so so that we don't talk over each other, I will call you out in the order that I've introduced you. Marie, please.
Okay, so I'll go first. Thank you for this invitation and thank you for being here, those of you who joined us. You know, Miriam, within about a month of Daphne's assassination, I received the news that a paper that I had been working on for several years was published in a good journal, the European Journal of Political Economy. And the paper was about partisanship. And in this paper, I explored the extent to which partisanship spills over beyond the vote, beyond the way that we read events, to actual behaviors outside the voting booth. In this paper, I was looking specifically at negative partisanship, which is that feeling of spite, of vindictiveness that we may have, that some of us may have towards the party we don't like, okay? And actually, let me rewind a little bit. Let's define what partisanship is. So it's not about political ideology or political interest. For example, I have a very high political interest, but a very low partisanship. Partisanship is about being emotionally attached to a party. It's not cognitive. It's often acquired quite early in life and stays with you. So what's negative partisanship? It's that feeling of dislike, deep dislike that you might have for the other party. come to your question, what did we learn with Daphne's assassination? We already knew that Malta was deeply divided along partisan lines. We already knew that there was negative partisanship, even if we may not have called it that way, but we would often have heard people saying things like, "Mariċna melek biex ma npaxxix il-gvern," so that's that kind of feeling. What we didn't know, or at least what I didn't expect, was the extent to which, when something is interpreted as being partisan, or someone, in this case, Daphne, the extent of cleavage that this can evoke, to the extent that an assassination can evoke emojis on Facebook that are not only sad, angry, or tear, but also happy and laughter. That's the extent to which, when somebody is interpreted as belonging to the other party, can create a cleavage in interpretation. Being here today will immediately evoke in some people a first layer of interpretation on whose side are we. And once they decide that we are on one side or the other, they will then interpret what we are saying and filter out in order for that to conform to their partisan loyalty. Not among everyone, but certainly among those who are deeply partisan towards Labour or deeply partisan towards PN, what we say will be heard in dramatically different ways.
Thank you, Mari. Matthew, please.
I found what Mari just said to be really moving, because over the past couple of years, over the past 4 years actually, what would make me most frustrated beyond the lack of justice and the years we spent with almost nothing happening in the investigation, would be seeing the extent of the vindictiveness in people who never knew my mother. Things that would happen in the physical world. For example, I would be accompanying my mother's sisters to lay flowers in the field where my mother's car stopped, and someone would make the sound of a bomb exploding while they were passing by in the car and shout something like, "She deserved it." And this still happens to this day. I mean, it happens almost every time my mother's sisters visit the field where the car stopped, or every time I visit the field where the car stopped. And also in the online world, when there's an article about my mother or about the case that's published by partisan media, there would be comments that, as Marie said, seem to celebrate the murder, seem to champion the people who carried out the murder. And this is something that my family and I have addressed with the Prime Minister directly. The problem that a large section of the population have been indoctrinated to hate my mother for partisan reasons. And for them, having the sort of gift of my mother's murderers getting away with the crime is more important than the principle of justice itself. And this is, of course, a huge danger to Malta's democracy, where there is a big section of the population that is willing to literally let people who are guilty of the most serious crimes that can be committed in a society walk free, because they see that as a service to the political party that they support.
Thank you, Matthew. Herman, can we have your comment?
I remember 2 or 3 years ago, I had interviewed Emmanuel Mifsud, who is the president of PEN Malta now. And I remember asking him about the tribalism in Malta to explain it. And Emmanuel had explained it really well. He said, in the past, we used to look up to the church. We always had the church there in the middle of the village, which always looked down on us, and we used to look up to it and adore that church. And in the last half generation, I would say, we've replaced that church with 2 other churches, the Nationalist Party and the Labour Party. And we have turned them into these kind of almost, demigods, and which we adore them at any cost, whatever they do. And what's surprising is that I thought there were 2 incidents, and at least in our recent history, where I thought it would have jolted us into changing the way we think. That was EU membership in 2004, and when Daphne was killed 4 years ago. Sadly, nothing happened. Nothing changed. We have become more entrenched. And I would dare to say that the tribalism I've seen in the last few years are among the worst I've ever seen in my journalism history. And I've been around for 25 years in this job. We've ended up in a situation where even us as journalists, whenever we are trying to probe corruption, scandals, to go after the people who might have been behind this terrible assassination, and we're branded as nationalists. We are told that you're doing this because you hate Labour. And in a way, I'm not surprised that we've ended up in this state, because this is a country where we tell school children not to talk about politics. We live in a country where grown-ups, all right, are scared to put their names to, when they're out there and talking publicly, that we should be talking about corruption, about discrimination, about racism. And we're scared. And I fear that some of this fear is also, self-induced. We are scared to speak out. So to answer your question, Miriam, I'd hate to say that after 4 years, I don't think we have learned much. And I think it's becoming obvious now that we have almost turned to the stage where people are giving up to the extent that they're actually leaving this country. I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you, Herman. George, please.
I mean, what we must remember is that it is in the best interest of the people who are governing Malta, and possibly even the opposition, that we remain in the state that we were then. Because this is very, very important, is the instrumentalization of that parochialism, if you like, which is all about. But we must remember something else, that when you're communicating with people who see things either as black or white, you need to go for the least common multiple element. In other words, you can't explain, yes, Daphne was sort of a bit in favor of the Nationalist Party, but then she wasn't at the end. No, you can't. You have to say, no, she was nationalist. And nationalists are, of course, evil. They are the devil. And that's where the instrumentalization came in. And a lot of what happened, the demonization of Daphne in order to set her up as a sacrificial lamb, if you like, okay, was actually organized. So a lot of what Marie mentioned, of what Matthew mentioned, and of course what Herman mentioned, okay, are actually, they're actually pawns being utilized by this machine which was created and which has not been dismantled. That is the problem. Okay, that is why nothing much has changed, because we were hoping that at some point this hate machine, which helped the Labour Party get into government and stay in government, if you like, in many ways, okay, would have been dismantled because there was no longer a need for it. But there still is, okay, because the only way that we can actually, retain the status quo, if you like, is by not throwing away a winning card. And you might say, yes, and we lost a journalist in the process, and we lost our reputation, and we became grey-listed and all the rest of it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the status quo is kept so that the power is retained. So these pawns that are, you know, our neighbors, if you like, okay, need to be kept at this level of frenzy. Otherwise, we know what will happen.
So it seems to me that all our speakers have agreed in a way, and I'm very interested in what Herman said. He touched upon the reasons behind this lack of change, and I'm wondering if any of you would like to respond to that or add from your point of view. What led to this lack of change?
And I think what George has just said is that, you know, the status quo benefits, I would say, the parties, not just the main parties, because it's very helpful to have a large group of people who are not critical, who are willing to, you know, filter out anything that's negative and remain there no matter what you do. That's a helpful group of people because they will always vote for you, and ultimately what a political party is interested in is the vote, is retaining power. It's also interesting that there seems to be an insufficient group of people who don't want to belong to either faction. Perhaps we are some of those, or perhaps we are not even seen as being among those. Maybe we're labeled because we're having a critical discussion. I suspect right now we're labeled as being nationalists. It would be different if there were a nationalist government and we were having a critical discussion, then we would be labeled as Labour. But my concern is, why isn't there more of us who want to talk? What is it that is stopping us or others? I'll venture some answers to this. First of all, when you are critical, you are a problem. You know, you're not going to be a yes person on a board and make sure that everything goes through without any problems. You get ousted from these things. I mean, I want to make a caveat that I don't feel in any way victimized because I speak out, but I do realize and I do understand that several opportunities don't come my way because I am not loyal. You know, I'm not loyal to a party. So I think that that is a reason why many people opt, if not to be deeply partisan, at least not to speak out, and so remain silent. And if we remain silent, if those of us who are not partisan remain silent, then the noise that the partisans make is even louder.
I disagree in a sense with you, Marie, in this way, in this sense, that there aren't enough of us. I mean, I think civil society showed its teeth when it was absolutely needed for civil society to do that. Okay, when the ousting of Joe Muscat and Keith Kemry and the rest was absolutely necessary, civil society was unrelenting. The problem is that obviously the machines went into motion and turned civil society also into the enemy. So logically, a lot of people who were of two minds, not at that point they weren't, then of course would have shifted back. That parochialist mentality is easy to shift back to the old way of thinking. But I do believe that if the cause is strong enough, then I think the people will rise again. And that is my greatest belief, and that is my greatest hope.
Matthew, would you like to add anything to that?
That I mean, I am way less qualified than, for example, Marie, to speak about the causes of partisanship. But in my limited experience of dealing with cases of corruption and nepotism and so on, there are cases of kind of historical grievances that create trauma, that creates trauma that crosses generations. It could have been some family member that in the past was denied some job or position or some contract or something like that, and that causes the family's support to sway from one political party to another. And that sort of unresolved grievance results in generations of partisanship. And the second thing is the systems of clientelism that are enjoyed by both parties, let's say, but will in the end end up eating them alive. These in the system, political parties see all of the tools, all of the resources at the disposal of government, and some not at the disposal of government, as tools and resources that are used for buying their way into power or continuing to maintain their hold on power. And I do believe that until this system is broken completely, then we would never be able to free itself from its effects, which include this kind of hyper partisanship, which includes this blind support. Because I am even surprised by people who are angry about high-level corruption in general, who then say things like, I'm in need of a job, or my child is in need of a job, or whatever, so I'll speak to so-and-so party official whom I know well, and they will be able to arrange a job for my relative. They do not see this as corruption, yet it is, and it's the kind of pervasive corruption that allows the two big political parties to maintain a hold on power that is itself corrupt. Regarding the sort of critical mass that George was referring to, I think that we might be able to achieve this by continuing to assist each other. There's safety in numbers, and I find it frustrating when people say things like, oh, I don't want to speak out about this injustice that's been done to me, because I am afraid that it will affect the career of my brother or my sister who works in government, for example. I find it difficult to understand that or kind of sympathize with that attitude. But if we show people that when they speak up about corruption, when they speak up about abuse of power, a whole network of people that we're a part of is going to support them, is going to speak for them, is not going to continue to victimize them, then perhaps more people will do it. Maybe there's empirical evidence for that, or maybe it's just wishful thinking. But I see it as one of the only strategies we have available.
Yes, that's right. And one of the roles of PEN Malta, after all. Herman, would you like to add anything to this?
Basically, the way I see it, I wish I get out of this, of this hamster wheel of hopelessness, but let's face it, we've been going on it for a generation now, and we need to be honest with ourselves. It's going to take a while to change it. This is not a normal country where blatant issues of corruption, nepotism shock the country, jolt the country into taking the streets and actually change everything. The Austrian chancellor resigned a couple of days ago over issues many people here would consider them as run of the mill. So it's no big deal. But remember, this is a country which gets most of information from TVM, One, Net, and Facebook. We don't read enough. We don't go to reliable sources. We still stick to the master's voice, whether it's my party, whether it's the state party, or even worse, Facebook, which has now put us all in our own bubble. And let's face it, talking about bubbles, Miriam, I can bet anything that most people who are following this debate are probably of the same mindsets, same beliefs, and want to call out for justice. So this is why I feel sometimes there's a bit of hopelessness. So unless we really start tackling the education system seriously, going for critical thinking, underlining the importance of critical thinking, of talking to each other, of the fact that it is okay to criticize your own government, doesn't mean you're criticizing the party, or criticizing my own party, but not really, it's not because I've turned or whatever. Couple that with the upbringing of all of us, of the way we tell our children of what is important to speak out against injustice, then I don't see much hope. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually picking up on something that happened to you, Herman, in a sense. Remember when you posted the advert for this talk on Facebook, one of the first comments was, all of them are from the same side.
Exactly.
And I loved your comment saying, so do we get a crook to, come sort of counter what you're about to say?
Incidentally, it was Anna Malia, one of Jürgen Fennick's lawyers, who posted that comment.
Yes. I noticed, yes, I noticed. And you actually put her in her place, which was excellent. But can I just sort of deviate slightly? Because we have been talking about partisanship. And of course, that is an essential part of who we are. I mean, let's face it, the smallness of the island was utilized by some very shrewd people in order to, to begin with, sort of, attract people to this mass, if you like, and eventually the power of incumbency is actually helping that, you know what I mean? But I'd like, because we are looking at, the years since Daphne was assassinated. And we do need to look at other elements that have actually retained that status quo I talked about. Yes, definitely the partisan manipulation, if you like, is there, but there's also state capture. And we must never forget that. We must never forget that, the party in power, I mean, all parties in power do this, but let's talk about this present government, because that's the one that there is right now, has made it very, very, has made sure that even if the partisan element sort of fails a bit or wanes a bit, that all institutions have been taken over, if you like. And that is why, I mean, I like to talk about the Konrad Mitzi syndrome. He's there, we talk about him for a little bit, then he says something and then he disappears. Have you noticed that Konrad Mitzi, who was one of the main architects of all the corruption, has barely appeared in court, has never said anything? He's being protected. There's a whole system there that is protecting people like Konrad Mitzi, like Joe Muscat, like so many others, that is in place. And that's another of the elements that have not changed at all, in spite of the fact that, a journalist was murdered. So, no, unfortunately, not much has changed, because it's important for not much to change in order for the next election to be won, and then the next, and of course, all the rest of it.
Thank you, George. One last question from me, just a quick question, because then we will go to the questions from the audience. So I noted two phrases that Matthew used: trauma across generations and unresolved grievances. And this makes me worry about a lot of things, but one thing in particular is the future of journalism. Do you think that the public has opened its mind to the importance of journalism? And will students opt to become journalists, seeing as we are in this situation we are in? I don't know who wants to start.
I can answer that. The answer is no. Miriam, I mean, we live in a country where the state treats the media as an inconvenient truth. You know, in fact, it just tolerates the media. It does not, the state here does not acknowledge the media as the fourth pillar of democracy. I'm the first one to say that the media screws up, that we make mistakes. Sometimes we're at each other's throats. But, you know, the fact that you have a government that is doing its utmost to pretend you don't exist, it's quite incredible. And then you have the army of people, of trolls saying, yes, because you're always critical of the government, or you're all that. But I go beyond that. I'm talking about the role of the media. It is incredible what our journalists sometimes have to go through. I'm talking about issues of life and death sometimes. It's about calling the AFM to tell them, we're informed there's a boat of 40 people outside Malta's shores and they're drowning. And you say, you get no answer. You don't know if it's true or not. And 2 days later, you might discover they're either dead or they've been rescued. You know, there are people within the government who will call our journalists and call them jokes, and you know, you send a freedom of information requests, and they're ignored. So tied in with the narrative of, you know, the media is just there to disturb the flow of what we have to do. Of course, we're in the situation, and which explains why not very few people want to become journalists. And trust me, there is a crisis in our sector. Nobody really wants to take on this job. And in a way, I don't blame them.
Can I tell you something? I did a bit of a straw poll amongst my students today, Herman, specifically, sort of because I knew we would be sort of bringing this up, and actually asked whether sort of the Daphne assassination plus the attacks on journalists, etc., has actually sort of stopped them wanting to become journalists. And all I can say is that those who did reply, the predominant majority, actually said that if nothing else, this is making them angry to the point where they want to actually be out there and defend democracy through journalism. Yes, there were people who said, but it doesn't pay. And, you know, the pay is bad, and we don't get enough sort of support to do investigative. But what I can say is that at least these young people sort of brought a bit of a smile to my face today, at least. I don't know, I see Rosemary here as well from MCAST. I don't know whether she has the same experience. They will, of course, lose hope eventually when they get into the business. But for the time being, all I can say is at least an assassination of a journalist has not scared them off.
George, there is a lot of romanticism around journalism. Once you get into the job, you realize it is not all about interviewing rock stars and doing, you know, you realize it's all about hard work, long hours, stressful trolls, every single day trolls, and it's unpleasant. So the minute they step in, normally they give up very easily.
But as you know, we do try to rake their noses in the, you know, in the poo.
Maybe at the expense of being critical, even in this panel here. So points one, George, obviously the students who gave up were not there to take your poll. So they're the ones who you had a little bit of a selection effect. But to Herman, I mean, I'm not sure if it's my place to ask questions, but I will ask this question. I mean, to what extent do we think that the media itself is failing to stand up to the challenge, in the sense of not being sufficiently critical? So many times I'm looking for something and I literally see a cut and paste of the same words issued from some press release everywhere.
I'm laughing because
there's not insufficient resources.
I'm laughing, and Herman is as well, because yesterday I told him exactly what you're telling
him. On Saturday, actually.
Is it a matter that they have insufficient financial resources or intellectual resources, or is it that there's too much media?
Mari, it's all of the above. It really is all of the above. Some people think there's an army of people in a newsroom. Imagine, we have the biggest newsroom in Malta. Today, post-budget, I only had 4 reporters, I think 4.5 reporters to cover everything. And you're telling journalists to do video, which we never did in the past, at least in my time. You're telling them to do online, you're telling them to do print. It's also very limited. The journalism scene has lost some really big names in the last few years, unfortunately. And it's quite sad to see it that way. So yes, definitely you are right, Mari, that there are problems and sometimes it is just a matter of not having anybody to upload the website. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, so maybe, I mean, one good place to start, as we are in Penn right now, is to think of what this community can do, even itself, to sort of become stronger and better and not spread itself so thinly to achieve outcomes, you know, because it's all well and good to point fingers, and which we have done, and I don't mind pointing fingers and saying things like, oh, people are too partisan and the government is captured, and you know, and there's not enough critical thinking. Yes, but we're not exactly wallflowers ourselves, you know, so I'm sure there's a lot that we can do.
But more, all of the above as well. Huh? We can't ignore the fact that all of the above is actually true. That is the point. I mean, and then, yes, we need to do something about it. That's basically it. Sorry.
Yes, I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying we can also do ourselves.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, in fact, Marie. Thank you. I am going to start with the questions from the audience. If anybody even on Facebook has more questions, please place them in the chat. It's very important to place them in the chat, please, and don't message me privately. So a question from Andrew Borch Cardona. Does the panel think that the doctrine of equivalency is actually useful? Daphne was killed under Labour. Labour and government failed to do anything to prevent it or to do anything to protect other journalists. So why this? And he quotes, they're all the same mantra.
I think I understand what Andrew means. Of course, like one of the worst things that can happen in any democracy is what political scientists call the triumph of cynicism. This is when corrupt or authoritarian politicians achieve their ultimate objective, which is not for them to rise above the competition, but to reduce all others to their same base level. So when you look at Russia, the classic example, what Putin does with the opposition led by Navalny is not to say, I'm so much more intelligent than him and to prove it, is not to say, I'm a much better policymaker than he is and to prove it, I'm a much better scientist and prove it. No, it's to smear him by introducing evidence, possibly contrived, into the domain that gets everyone saying, oh, you know, it turns out he's just as corrupt as the rest of them. So they're all the same. And when you have the majority of people in our society thinking like that, it's like whack-a-mole trying to sort of convince everyone that, hang on a minute, but it isn't actually like that, because there are degrees, and what X person did is so many more degrees worse than what Y person did. But this is a kind of argument that you can never win. And after spending what I believe was a lot of wasted time attempting to have these arguments with people, I just gave up and said, okay, the work of my family and the work of the foundation is not going to be sort of comparative work where we say X person is better than Y person, and what about this grievance that is so much worse than that other grievance. It's to fight our fight for justice and show others the possibilities of what can be done in the face of some injustice, and hopefully inspire those other people to do the same thing. And instead of spending all our time listening to people saying, oh, you know, they're all the same, they're just as bad, politicians are all corrupt, I never vote for anyone, and so on, spend more time kind of proving that they're wrong by showing that no, not all activists are the same as Nationalist Party activists or Labour Party activists, and no, not all politicians are corrupt, and no, they're not all as bad as each other. So we just focus on this work.
Thank you, Matthew.
A stab at answering, if I may, Miriam, because I think this was a
Yes, please.
question by Andrew Borch Cardona. Because when we were speaking about partisanship, we were talking about both parties. And yes, when we're talking about partisanship, it is an issue which is prevalent in both parties. My own research finds that there's deeper partisanship and more people who are loyal in Labour, something which I'm sure that many anecdotally will confirm, because nationalists tend to be less or more openly critical, as we saw in what happened over these years as well. But that's just the general trend. Partisanship, yes, exists in both parties. But where it stops being equivalent is when we're talking about governance, because then we're talking about the party in government. Now, right now, the party in government, and therefore, unfortunately for them, the subject of criticism, is the Labour Party. When the Nationalist Party was in government, I was equally critical, even though I worked in the civil service at that time. And so therefore, the equivalence is not of the two parties, but when you are in government, expect to be criticized. So I will not right now be criticizing the Nationalist Party to the extent, or be, rather, let's not say criticizing. I will not be examining what the Nationalist Party does at this moment to the extent that I am examining what the Labour Party does in government, because my interest is in governance, who is governing and how they are governing. As far as I'm concerned, I would like the Nationalist Party to do better for the sake of having a good opposition. But as far as I'm concerned, they're not of interest to me. What's of interest to me right now is who is governing and how they're governing. So no, it's not equivalent.
Yeah, I'm sorry we have to defend ourselves, actually, because I actually disagree with Andrew's comments. I mean, let's face it, we have been talking about what's been happening since Daphne was assassinated. And I think it's been pretty clear what we've been talking about. If we're talking about the instrumentalization of partisanship, if we've been talking about state capture, if we've been talking about, a lot of people just, hiding, just putting stuff under the carpet and sweeping it there and leaving it there. If we talk about procrastination of, getting people into court, etc., I don't think we're talking about the other lot, are we? Sorry, Andrew, I disagree with your comments. Apologies. Not apologizing now at all.
Thank you, George. I'm going to move to the next question, as we have quite a few questions from Daiva. We should talk not just about the assassination, but also the slaps that came before that. Not every journalist has enough resources for legal fees. Are lawyers going to step up and offer their services to protect the media? Don't know if anybody has a comment for this.
I mean, I can comment because we're facing a slap ourselves. I've been sued by the owner of Sata Bank in Bulgaria. Luckily, we've got some international support. There's the ECPMF. It's a fantastic organization which does offer some financial help. I know there are some lawyers here who do try to help behind the scenes, and there are some lawyers who are really going way beyond their call of duty here. But perhaps, yes, it could be good that whenever there is, Matthew mentioned it earlier, whenever there are these kinds of threats, or even when somebody forges ahead with slap, there are more people coming out and shouting, this is not right. I am not pretending to say the media doesn't screw up, so we shouldn't be subject to any legal scrutiny or action. Go ahead. But do it in my country, do it in a place where this story has come out under local jurisdiction. Don't try to abuse of your, simply because you're just some rich bastard in some country, you know, where I'm going to have to engage lawyers, which could very well sink the organization. So this is the shit we're getting. But yes, Taiva, it would be nice to always see this kind of, you know, offer of help from some lawyers. There are very few of them that do offer, but there are some.
So apart from what Herman mentioned, which is the international NGOs, including ECPMF, that offer support, especially on cross-border cases, where journalists in Malta are sued by someone in another country. The Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation has set up a project called the Public Interest Litigation Network. And what we did was bring together a network of lawyers who are prepared to offer pro bono support on a variety of different cases. And this would also include the SLAPP cases. So if you are currently facing a SLAPP threat, that could even be a vexatious legal letter, then I encourage you to contact us, to contact the Public Interest Litigation Network.
And this is one of the good things that has come out, at least, you know, out of this tragedy. There has been some movements of people coming together to fight a common cause. The Daphne Foundation has been doing some incredible work behind the scenes that not many people know of it. And this is what Matthew is mentioning is one of them, because we're also working with them where it comes to SLAPP.
Thanks, Herman.
Thank you both. Question from Norbert Celia. I am surprised that in such a discussion, no one is touching on the fact that hyper-partisanship also has its roots in class divide, i.e., those born with privilege and those whose families had to make extreme sacrifices to move upwards in the world. Perhaps Marie?
I'll talk about this because I want to say that people being partisan are not being idiots. You know, there's a reason to be partisan. Sometimes it's an investment. It's an investment in your family. For example, if you don't have money, wealth, education, other forms of privilege, you invest in the party with full loyalty because the party will give you back, right? So what we have to understand is, and not point fingers and say, oh my God, you know, these people are such idiots and they're so partisan and they'll wave a flag no matter what, but really try to understand why that is the choice, why that happened. Matthew mentioned earlier, it may have been some trauma back and then it keeps on, you know, perpetuating itself through family lines and so forth. But the fact that so many people feel such a need to invest themselves so entirely in a political party makes me wonder what has failed that they don't invest in themselves instead, that they don't feel empowered to act on their own 2 feet. Why isn't it that many other people feel an urge and the need to be heard and to be out of the sort of partisan fray? I really think we need to understand this, and we need to go a little bit beyond saying, you know, it's the new church. Okay, but why was there church and why is there the new church? And why isn't the media strong enough? So we need to ask these questions, I guess, which are a little bit harder than saying, you know, which side are you on, or why are you, or you know, or just sort of despairing at it, but sort of trying to have a deeper conversation.
What I find interesting, Marie, because I agree with what you said, is that it is hard to see a relationship between partisanship and economic mobility, because no matter how upwardly economically or socially mobile people are, it does not seem to have any impact on levels of partisanship, sorry. This to me is the inexplicable thing. So
there is like with higher education, you get lower in general. There is a disconnect between education. So the lower educated tend to be, you're going to observe many people who have high education and are deeply partisan, of course, but the trend is a negative relationship, even in Malta. So yes, I suppose with greater education and greater ability to move upwardly without the need of the lever of the party, we will get a sort of loosening of this partisanship. Incidentally, we did also observe mobility between the Nationalist Party and the Labour Party when there was the large electoral win. So we do see some shifts, and one can even argue that deeply partisan people are partisan by nature, and no matter which party, they're going to invest heavily. So you could get this sort of shift between parties, but still be partisan, if you know what I mean. So the characteristic there is the desire to be loyal to a party.
If I may, Mar, the point is very, very, I mean, I agree with you entirely, of course, because I mean, the link between education and sort of level of partisanship is very clear also in the literature. But of course, the literature also talks about the system of patronage, that people with a lower educational capability and therefore less security in themselves will actually seek as being their crutch, if you like, within society. So we've seen that. And yes, I mean, I'm going to go one step further with this, so to speak, partisanship aspect, because it's actually the name of the party that they support. Because we have seen, for example, I know, Labour Party, for example, moving away from a strictly socialist regime to a purely liberal, I mean, stance, especially when it comes to economics, etc., and yet, of course, the name, Labour Party, etc., remains, and that is what people will aspire to. That is what they will try to push forward. So there isn't even any sense in the link between the classist, if you like, element and the party that are supported, as far as I can tell, at least.
Thank you both. So I'm going to take the last two. There are many questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to answer them all, but let's try a couple more at least. One in particular for Herman, please, from Ritian Maliatabone. Agree that there is a systematic brainwashing of an anti-debate mentality instilled from school age. While stuff to ask you to answer how to fix it, can we ask if you think offering debating fora for age-specific groups online would help? We used to use letters to the editor in our time, and how about today? Is this still active, or is there still a silo effect?
I think we have more opportunities for debate than we've ever had. The problem is, I think those people who have something to say are being shouted out of the debates. And I fear this has become more predominant in the last few years, especially with Facebook being so big in Malta. As a medium, we try to create as much debate as possible. Obviously, we get accused of all sorts of things, being in favor of one party and the other. We're accused of being pro-migrant and whatever that means. So as a medium, we do try to create a debate as much as possible. But I think, we tend sometimes, I hate saying this, but we tend to say, is the media's fault, or is that everything has changed? The media is not as effective as it was 30, 40 years ago before social media. Let's be brutally honest with ourselves. Facebook and Google has taken over our means of communication. They dictate what, they think you want to hear. And that is the way it is all changing. If I open my Facebook wall now, you'd think all the people in the world, at least, are pro-integration, somewhat liberal, into culture, into theater, into music. It's bullshit. That's not Malta, you know, but this is what I am being fed from Facebook. So we need to really be brave and step out of our comfort zone and be able to debate possibly with people who are not like-minded, but we can have a proper civil debate as much as possible. I try to live in hope.
Yes, and I hope
So
that
do I.
this discussion is just the first of many, because the hour has passed very, very quickly. So I'm going to pose two more questions, one from Maria Frendo. It's weeks since the results of the Daphne inquiry were published. What are we doing to force the government to act on the suggestions made clear in that inquiry? It's evident that government is hoping that we forget, which of course we won't, but precisely because we won't, we have to act hard and swift.
I think Matthew should answer this question.
Yes, I mean, what government what government of the options that we have in Malta would not want the country to forget something like that? It's clear that the government simply wants to move past it, and it's on us to make sure that that does happen, but with the recommendations being implemented. Because of course we do not want the country to be stuck with yet another historical grievance to add to the long list of grievances that we already have to carry as a burden. And the only way we can do that is by making sure that the recommendations are implemented in the proper way. Otherwise, it will always remain a problem. The government never fulfilled its promises, never respected the findings of the public inquiry, and so on. We still have this window of opportunity that's open to change the country by implementing the recommendations of the public inquiry. And it's still up to us, I think, and the government as well, to choose whether we take that opportunity or not. Of course, people like us have to keep pushing the government, otherwise it will simply ride roughshod over the public inquiry.
Thank you, Matthew. The very last question, and I'm really sorry that we won't be able to take any more questions and comments. So the question from Rosemary Kaleya: do you think that polarization will decrease if party media will cease? Sorry,
I don't mean to, but I feel really strongly about this. Without a doubt, yes. I mean, it is. I cannot express how strongly I feel about this, because to me, party media is it's hard to overstate how detrimental its effect has been to our society. Because once people are indoctrinated by party media, it will take either the equivalent or a greater effort to de-indoctrinate them. So think of the millions of euros that have been spent on party media broadcasts, on newspapers, the columns that have been written, the shows that have been produced on Net and One and so on, indoctrinating people. The equivalent of that or more will have to be done to reverse the effects of that indoctrination. And this is, of course, not something that is going to happen within my lifetime. The least we can do is stop the bleeding or stop the damage that is still being done. And the only way to do that is to shut down party media or to get political parties to disband their media. one of the most shocking revelations in this regard came, when was it, a couple of days ago or a week ago, when the Times published its report on Jürgen Fenech's promised €200,000 payments to the Labour Party via One Productions. I mean, let's sort of rewind a little bit. A story like that is broken, that your media organization has been used as a vehicle for corruption, for illicit lobbying by a person who is now indicted for the murder of a journalist. And yet you turn up for work the next day as though nothing has happened. Because what happened after the day that report came out in the Times of Malta? The Super One cameraman turned up for work. The Super One journalist turned up for work. The Super One editor turned up for work. The Union of Journalists did not have a vote on whether to expel these people from the union. There were absolutely zero repercussions for any of the people involved. So this is how extreme the situation we're in is, that we're behaving as though all of this is normal, that it's normal for political party media to be used not just as a vehicle for egregious propaganda that smears people day in, day out, spreads disinformation, but that is actually used as a vehicle for political corruption, as a vehicle for money laundering. It's outrageous that this should happen in a European democracy, yet not a single word was said beyond that Times of Malta article. Sorry, I don't mean to intercede on every question, but I just feel really strongly about this.
But Matthew,
By all means.
you have a right to, Matthew. The point is this, it's very clear. The problem is that they are propagating the lie as being the truth. And that becomes the normal for a lot of people. And that, unfortunately, is the case throughout. Yes, they are manipulating the minds of their supporters in order to retain them. And that's unfortunate. And I'm not as optimistic as you are, because they're digging their heels in when it comes to party media. But I am hoping that, if there is enough pressure, then something will happen. I hope so, at least.
Thank you both.
I think what makes it another layer of sort of problematic is that it is even subsidized by the state. So the fact that you're not paying taxes, there can be media with an agenda, and much media has an agenda and is financed. The problem becomes when it's, apart from spreading, let's say, nuanced truth at best, it's also funded by the state. But I was going to say to you, Miriam, that I think what we have here is the agenda for the next discussion, because I really think that this needs to be talked about. And
actually, the department, actually had a media talk seminar about it, where we got the president of the Labour Party, the general secretary of the Nationalist Party, and Chris Perugin duking it out. And believe me, it was a 4-hour fight. Okay, so and it left us nowhere basically in the end, because that is the point. Everybody digs deep and just wants to do it. It's unfortunate, but there you go. That's the reality of that we're working with, isn't it?
Well, we'll certainly think about it, Marie, and very interesting points came up today. I can't believe how quick the hour went by, but that brings today's discussion to a close, I'm afraid. Before I let you get on with your evening, we have some news. We've been informed by PEN International that this Friday there will be a vigil for Daphne in London, and we will post the link of the event on our social media platform. So those of you who are tuning in from London will know exactly where to go. So thanks once again to our panelists, Matthew, Marie, Herman, and George. Thank you for answering the questions in brief and not getting to the point, so that our audience can listen to everybody. May this be the first of many such discussions, so that we can grow together and learn from each other, so that we can keep fighting for justice and truth. In fact, I believe that we can in fact get stronger and smarter than the corrupt and the greedy. We just have to keep doing what we're doing. like some of you said, in fact. So that's it from me. Thank you and good night.